The mountain is a graveyard of secrets, and in the winter of 1884 the snow was hungry for more. They say a man goes up into the high country to forget the world, but the world has a way of tracking a man down, even through a blizzard that can blind a wolf. Mark thought he was alone in the Bitterroot Range, surrounded by nothing but the ache of the cold and the weight of a silent conscience. He had built a fortress of cedar and isolation, but a single act of mercy, saving a half-frozen stray from a drift, cracked the ice of his sanctuary. He didn't know that the dog carried the scent of a life he'd tried to bury, or that the desperate pounding on his door at midnight would bring a woman who claimed the animal was hers. But as the shadows lengthened, and the mountain began to groan with the weight of a coming avalanche, Mark realized the dog wasn't just a stray, it was a lure. And the woman standing in the snow wasn't just looking for a pet, she was bringing the very past he had climbed these peaks to escape. The winter of 1884 did not arrive with a whisper. It came as an iron fist, crushing the high country under a weight of white death. Deep in the jagged spine of the Bitterroot Range, Mark moved through the drifts like a ghost. He was a man who had traded the noise of civilization for a silence so profound it rang in his ears. Every breath was a gamble, every step was a calculation against the frost that sought to turn his blood to ice. He was heading back to his hand-hewn cabin when he saw it, a dark, unmoving shape half buried in a drift. It wasn't a fallen branch. It wasn't a predator. It was a dog. A matted frame of bone and frozen fur, its breathing so shallow it barely disturbed the powder beneath its muzzle. Mark looked down at the animal and felt a cold ache in his chest. It was a memory of a world he'd left behind, a reminder of the fragility of living things. He could have walked away. The mountain expected him to. Instead, he reached down into the freezing white and scooped the creature into his arms. It was lighter than he expected, a skeleton wrapped in ice. He carried it back to the cabin, the wind rising to a howl behind him like a wolf denied its meal. Inside, the air was seasoned with the ghost of previous fires and the deep, earthy stillness of old timber. He laid the dog on a pallet of burlap sacks near the hearth and set to work. He didn't use a gentle hand. Gentleness was a luxury he couldn't afford. He worked with a grim, focused intensity, rubbing the life back into the dog's stiff limbs near the orange glow of the embers. Hours bled into the night. The storm hammered at the logs, demanding entry. Then a paw twitched. A low-pained whimper broke the stillness, a sound so human in its suffering it made Mark draw back. The dog's eyes flickered open, amber and clouded, reflecting the flickering firelight. In that gaze there was no wildness, only a profound, searching recognition. Mark offered a wooden bowl of warmed broth, watching as the animal lapped at it with trembling uncertainty. The man sat back in his chair, his own body aching from the day's labor, and realized the silence of the cabin had changed. It was no longer the empty silence of a tomb. It was the shared silence of two breathing things waiting for the dawn. He told himself it was merely a temporary arrangement, a brief interruption in his chosen isolation. He did not yet know that the dog was a harbinger, a bridge between his frozen sanctuary and the world he thought he had buried. As the fire died down to glowing coals, the dog crawled toward him, resting its heavy head on the toe of his boot. Mark did not move away. He sat in the dark, listening to the rhythmic pulse of another heart, unaware that miles away through the blinding white curtain of the blizzard, someone was following the trail he had left behind. The following days fell into a grueling rhythm of survival. Mark moved through his chores with a newfound haste, always feeling the weight of the dog's gaze from the shadows of the hearth. He refused to give the animal a name. A name was a tether, and Mark had spent years cutting every cord that bound him to the living. But the dog, a brindle-furred creature with a deep chest and intelligent eyes, began to mend with a speed that defied the mountain's cruelty. It followed him across the small room, its paws clicking rhythmically on the hand-planed floorboards. There was a haunting silence to the animal, a gratitude that felt heavier than any debt Mark had ever owed. Mark shared his meager rations of salted venison and hardtack, watching the dog regain its strength. To fill the hollow spaces of the cabin, he began to speak, not out of a need for company, but to drown out the intrusive thoughts that the dog's presence stirred. He spoke of the timberline, of the way the rivers choked with ice in '78, and why he had climbed so high that the air itself felt thin and pure. The dog listened with a tilted head, its ears twitching at the cadence of a voice that had forgotten the sound of its own softness. Outside, the world turned into a brittle museum of frost. The windows were nothing but squares of leaden light, and the wind became a physical shove against the heavy oak door. By the fourth night, the dog was no longer a guest. It was a sentinel. It paced the perimeter of the room, sniffing at the rusted traps and the heavy furs hanging from the rafters. Mark watched from his chair, an unlit pipe clamped between his teeth, sensing a strange tension in the air. The dog would stand for hours by the door, its nose pressed to the threshold where the draft whistled through the gaps. It didn't bark or scratch. It simply waited with a mournful patience that made the hair on the back of Mark's neck stand up. He knew the mountain didn't give gifts without a price, and he wondered what debt he had invited into his home. The bond solidified on the fifth evening when the silence was shattered. A massive branch, overburdened by ice, snapped with the crack of a rifle shot just outside the walls. The dog didn't cower or run for the shadows. It leaped to its feet and stood between Mark and the door, a low vibrating growl rumbling through its ribs. Mark's hand went instinctively to his Sharps rifle, the cold steel familiar and reassuring. He looked at the dog, its hackles raised, its spirit mirroring his own defensive posture. In that moment, the hierarchy of man and beast vanished. They were a pack, two survivors guarding a fortress against a world that wanted them dead. As the week drew to a close, the storm broke, leaving behind a deceptive, crystalline calm. The temperature plummeted further, turning the snow into a crust of glass. Mark stepped out onto the porch to survey the damage, the dog pressing close to his heel. The silence of the peaks was absolute, a ringing void that made his ears ache. He looked down and saw the dog staring intensely toward the valley floor, its body vibrating with a sudden, sharp recognition. It let out a single piercing howl that tore through the frozen air, a sound of profound longing. Mark realized then that the dog wasn't a stray at all. It was a messenger that had been separated from its master, and the master was closer than he could have imagined. The sixth day arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum, heavy and strangely still. Mark spent the morning checking the roof, the dog never more than a few feet from his shadow. The animal's recovery had shifted into a restless energy. It would stop and scent the air, its body quivering as its eyes fixed on the narrow path winding up from the valley floor. Mark felt a growing unease, a premonition that the sanctuary he had built over 5 years of exile was about to be breached. He checked the action of his rifle and ensured the heavy bar on the door was seated deep in its iron brackets. He had come here to be forgotten, but the mountain was a poor keeper of secrets. By afternoon, the temperature dropped so sharply that the timber of the cabin began to groan and pop. Mark sat by the window carving a piece of cedar, his eyes frequently darting to the tree line where the shadows were beginning to bleed together. The dog was now stationed permanently by the door, its head low, its tail giving a single tentative thump against the floorboards every few minutes. It was the sound of a heart divided between the man who had saved it and the memory of another. Mark tried to ignore the tightness in his throat. He had convinced himself he wanted nothing from the world, yet the thought of the cabin returning to its previous emptiness felt like a fresh wound. As the sun touched the horizon, a sound broke the crystalline silence. It wasn't the crack of a branch or the cry of a predator. It was the rhythmic metallic clink of a harness and the soft crunch of boots on frozen crust. The dog exploded into a frenzy, scratching at the door with whimpers that turned into high-pitched yelps of frantic joy. Mark stood, his hand going instinctively to the belt at his waist. He moved to the door, peering through the small, thick-paned window. A figure was emerging from the white haze of the lower slope, moving with a staggering, desperate gait. It was a person nearly swallowed by a heavy wool coat and a tattered shawl, swaying with exhaustion. The stranger reached the porch and collapsed against the wood, the sound of the impact echoing through the logs. The dog's desperation was now a physical force, its body slamming against the door in an effort to reach whoever was on the other side. Mark hesitated, his mind racing through 100 scenarios of ambush, legacies of a life he had tried to outrun. But the sound that came through the wood was a human sob, raw and stripped of all pretense. It was a sound that didn't belong in the high peaks, a cry of profound grief and sudden impossible hope. Mark threw back the heavy bar and swung the door open. A gust of crystalline cold swept in, and with it, the figure tumbled forward onto the floor. The dog was instantly upon her, licks and whines raining down on a face pale as the drifts outside. The stranger was a woman, her eyes sunken and her lips blue with the onset of frostbite. But as she clutched the dog's neck, a look of transcendent relief washed over her features. She looked up at Mark, her breath hitching in her chest, and for the first time in a decade, Mark looked into the eyes of someone who saw him not as a ghost or a hermit, but as a savior. The woman lay on the floorboards, her shivering so violent it shook the very foundation of the small room. Mark acted with the cold efficiency of a man used to treating his own wounds, hauling her toward the warmth of the hearth while the dog circled them, a frantic blur of brindle fur. He draped a heavy buffalo robe over her shoulders and forced a cup of hot water and honey between her chattering teeth. Her hands were raw, the skin split by the biting wind, and her boots were worn through to the soles. She was a ghost of a woman, a fragile thing that had survived a journey that should have claimed her life 10 miles back. As the heat began to penetrate her frozen limbs, she found her voice, though it was little more than a dry rasp. She spoke of a small settlement in the valley that had been ravaged by the fever, of a husband she had buried in the frozen earth, and of the dog, the only living thing she had left in a world turned to ash. The animal had vanished during a whiteout a week ago, and she had followed the memory of its scent and the desperate pull of her own heart. She had climbed through the dead of night, guided by nothing but the faint, impossible hope that her companion had found a light in the dark. Mark listened in a heavy silence, his back turned to her as he stoked the fire. Her presence was a sensory intrusion. The soft rustle of her skirts and the scent of damp wool filled the spaces that had belonged only to the smell of wood smoke and old iron. He felt a surge of resentment that was quickly swallowed by a deeper, more painful empathy. He recognized the look in her eyes, the hollow stare of one who had seen their entire world dismantled by the cruelty of the seasons. He had come to the mountain to escape the sight of such suffering, yet here it was, kneeling on his rug, clutching the dog he had grown to love. The dog sensed the shifting tide of emotion in the room. It moved between them, nudging Mark's hand with its wet nose, before returning to lay its head in the woman's lap. It was a bridge of flesh and bone, connecting two souls who had sought the high places for very different reasons. Mark saw the way her fingers buried themselves in the dog's thick coat, and he knew that the animal belonged to her in a way it could never belong to him. He was a caretaker of a borrowed life, a temporary harbor for a creature that was destined for another shore. The night outside grew darker, the wind picking up a mournful rhythmic thrumming against the chimney. The woman, whose name was Sarah, eventually succumbed to the exhaustion of her ordeal, falling into a fitful sleep near the fire. Mark sat in his chair, the Sharps rifle resting across his knees, watching the flickering shadows dance across the logs. He looked at the woman and the dog, huddled together for warmth, and realized that his solitude had been a lie. He had not been living, he had been waiting. The arrival of the dog had been the crack in the ice, and the woman's knock at the door was the breaking of the dam. The morning arrived with a stillness that felt brittle, as if the world might shatter at the slightest sound. Mark had not slept. He had spent the long hours watching the woman's chest rise and fall, a fragile rhythm that seemed out of place against the harsh geometry of his life. Sarah awoke as the first grey light filtered through the frosted window, her eyes darting around the cabin in momentary terror until they landed on the dog. The animal greeted her with a soft, rolling moan of affection, and the tension left her shoulders. She looked at Mark, who was standing by the stove with his back to her, and the weight of her gratitude was a physical presence in the room. They spoke little, for the mountain did not encourage idle words. Mark prepared a meal of salt pork and cornmeal, serving her with a stoic grace that masked the turmoil in his mind. He learned through broken sentences that she had no one left to return to in the valley. The fever had been thorough, and her home was now a place of echoes and empty chairs. She had climbed the mountain not just to find her dog, but because the heights offered a different kind of ending than the slow rot of a grieving town. Mark understood this better than he cared to admit. He saw in her the same jagged edges that had driven him into the timber years ago, a soul seeking a place where the cold could numb the parts of the heart that still hurt. As the sun climbed higher, The dog became the center of their shared world. It sensed the unspoken bond between the two humans, moving from one to the other as if trying to weave their separate isolations together. Mark watched Sarah's hands as she worked to repair a tear in her shawl with a needle and thread he had provided. Her movements were steady, a testament to a life spent in the service of survival. There was a quiet strength in her, a resilience that the mountain had tested and failed to break. Mark found himself drawn to the way she occupied the space, turning the cold utilitarian cabin into something that resembled a home, if only for an hour. However, the peace was a thin veil. By midday, the wind began to shift, bringing with it a low, ominous rumble from the higher peaks. Mark knew the sound. It was the groan of the snowpack under its own weight, a warning that the recent storm had left the slopes unstable. The dog began to pace again, its ears pinned back, a low growl starting deep in its throat. Mark moved to the window, his eyes scanning the white expanse above. He saw a plume of snow dusting off a ridge a mile up, a white flag of surrender before the coming slide. The threat he had sensed since the dog arrived was no longer a shadow. It was a wall of ice waiting for a reason to fall. He turned to Sarah, his face set in a grim mask of determination. He told her they could not stay. The cabin was built in the lee of a granite outcrop, but the magnitude of the coming slide would bury anything in its path. They had to move, and they had to move now, into the teeth of the deepening cold. Sarah did not argue. She stood, wrapping the buffalo robe around her, and looked at Mark with a trust that made his hands tremble as he checked his gear. They were two strangers and a dog, preparing to face the raw fury of the mountain, bound together by a series of accidents that felt more like destiny than luck. The mountain gave its final warning with a sound like the world splitting in two. Mark grabbed his pack and the heavy wool blanket, ushering Sarah and the dog toward the threshold. The air outside was a frantic swirl of white, the sky and the ground merging into a single blinding abyss. They moved with a desperate urgency, Mark breaking the trail through chest-high drifts, while Sarah clung to the dog's makeshift harness, her fingers numb and claw-like. Every step was a battle against the crushing weight of the atmosphere, the wind trying to steal the very breath from their lungs. They had only been clear of the cabin for minutes when the roar intensified, a physical pressure that vibrated in their marrow. Mark looked back once, a massive shelf of snow, 1,000 tons of white death, detached from the upper ridge with a slow, sickening grace. It descended like a tidal wave, swallowing the pines and the rocky outcrops in a deafening shroud of powder. The cabin, the only home Mark had known for years, vanished in an instant, pulverized by the sheer momentum of the slide. There was no time for grief. The edge of the avalanche sent a wall of displaced air screaming toward them, a concussive force that knocked them flat into the snow. Mark threw his body over Sarah and the dog, shielding them as the world turned into a churning vortex of ice and dark. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. Mark clawed his way out of the suffocating powder, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pulled Sarah upward, her face ghost-white and caked in frost, her eyes wide with the shock of being alive. The dog emerged next, shaking its fur and letting out a sharp, defiant bark that echoed against the newly carved face of the mountain. They were alive, but they were exposed. The sanctuary was gone, replaced by a landscape of jagged debris and the looming threat of the night. Mark looked at the woman he had saved twice now, and he saw no fear in her eyes, only the iron will to endure. He led them toward a shallow cave he knew was tucked into the leeward side of the granite spires, a place where the wind could not reach. They huddled together in the narrow stone throat of the mountain, the dog pressed between them, acting as a living furnace. Mark used the last of his dry kindling to start a small, flickering flame, the light dancing off the frozen walls. He looked at Sarah, her hands finally beginning to warm as she stroked the dog's head. The revelation of the day was not the destruction of his home, but the realization that the walls he had built around his heart had fallen long before the cabin did. As the storm outside began to lose its teeth, Mark reached out and took Sarah's hand. It was the first time he had touched another human being in years without the necessity of survival. It was an acknowledgement of their shared fragility, a silent pact made in the belly of the mountain. They had lost everything to the snow, his shelter, her past, the very ground they stood on. But they had found something in the wreckage that the cold could not touch. The dog looked from one to the other, its amber eyes bright with a quiet, ancient knowing. The pack was complete, and though the path down the mountain would be long and treacherous, they would not walk it alone. The morning light that filtered into the stone cave was not the harsh, blinding white of the storm, but a soft crystalline gold that spoke of a truce with the elements. Mark watched the embers of their small fire pulse with a dying orange glow, his body stiff from the night spent on the cold floor. Beside him, Sarah was still asleep, her head resting on the dog's flank. The animal was awake, its ears forward, watching the entrance of the cave with a steady, protective vigilance. Mark realized then that the mountain had stripped him of his solitude not to punish him, but to save him from a slow, cold death of the spirit. He looked at the woman who had walked through hell for a stray dog and saw the path back to the world he had once abandoned. They spent the early hours of the day preparing for the descent. There was no cabin to return to, no stores of grain or furs left to reclaim. They had only what they carried and the clothes on their backs, yet the loss did not feel like a burden. Mark fashioned a sturdy walking stick for Sarah and shared the last of his dried meat, divided equally between the three of them. The dog seemed to understand the shift in the air. It no longer paced with anxiety, but moved with a purposeful, bounding energy, leading them toward the tree line where the snow was less treacherous. As they stepped out into the crisp, biting air, Mark took one last look at the scar on the mountainside where his life had been buried, and then he turned his back on it forever. The journey down was a test of endurance, a long, rhythmic march through the hushed cathedral of the pines. They moved in a shared silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the sound of their combined breathing and the crunch of boots on the crust. Whenever Sarah stumbled, Mark's hand was there to steady her, his touch certain and strong. They were moving toward the valley, toward the uncertainty of a town that had been broken by sickness and the challenges of rebuilding a life from the soil up. But as Mark looked at the dog leading the way and the woman walking at his side, he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. By the time they reached the lower foothills, the air had begun to soften, smelling of damp earth and the distant promise of a thaw. They saw the first plumes of smoke from the settlement in the distance, a sign that life was persisting despite the winter's cruelty. Mark stopped at the edge of the timber, looking out over the valley that he had once vowed never to enter again. He felt the dog's cold nose press against his palm, and he felt Sarah's hand slip into his. The mountain man had become something else. A protector, a partner, a man who had found his way home through the most unlikely of guides. The story of the man from the peaks and the woman who found her dog would become a legend in that small valley, whispered by firesides for generations. It was a story of how the wild can sometimes be the only place where the human heart can truly find its warmth. Mark and Sarah built a new life, one not defined by isolation, but by the shared strength of survivors. The dog lived out its days by their hearth, a living reminder of the night the snow brought them together. For in the end, it was not the mountain that was conquered, but the fear of being needed, and the silence of a man who finally found a voice worth sharing.